over here. Bringing the library into their homes. We're so grateful that we have this technology where we can have people join us in whatever way they feel comfortable. So I'm very excited. I'm Janet Torsney, by the way. I'm the director of the library. Very happy to be here. The celebrity guests, you'll hear more from them later. My first job is to introduce Mary Packer, who is the director of the Montclair Public Library Foundation.
Hello and welcome. Welcome. It's wonderful to see so many people in person. It just feels like a new day. So lovely to be here. On behalf of the foundation, I want to welcome you. I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Investors Bank Foundation, who's had a long time relationship with Open Book, Open Mind. The Library Foundation is made up of your friends and neighbors, and our mission is to raise money in support of library programs like this one, things that make the library truly special. The foundation also supports staff development, access to digital resources, and other needs not covered by city funding. So your donation might support an initiative like lending laptops or Wi-Fi hotspots for residents without internet access, lifelong learning classes, tutoring, resume help, and children's literacy programs. So after you enjoy the event tonight, please consider making a donation on the foundation website at montclairplf.org. Gifts of all sizes have an impact, and we would be so grateful for your support. Thank you very much and enjoy the program.
Thank you very much, Mary. And thank you all for your support of writers and readers and libraries and public libraries in particular, and the Montclair Public Library in extra particular. So thank you. It is my great pleasure to introduce Kate Tuttle, who will then introduce two fine women. Kate is the book editor of the Boston Globe. She's also a judge for the National Book Award, and perhaps most important for us today, she is the co-chair of the Open Book, Open Mind Advisory Committee, the wonderful group of people who brought this to you. Kate.
Hi, everyone. So I'm here to just give a little information about these authors, although you may have already read them both, and you may have even seen them both speak, if you're so lucky. I'll start with Christina Baker Kline, who will be performing the interview today. She's the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 8 novels, including The Exiles, Orphan Train, and A Piece of the World, and the author and/or editor of 5 nonfiction books. She's a former longtime resident of Montclair. And then sitting over my right shoulder is Elliott Dark, the author of Think of England and 2 collections of short stories, In the Gloaming and Naked to the Waist. Her work has appeared in the New Yorker, Harper's, the New York Times, American Short Stories, and O. Henry Prize Stories, among others. Her award-winning short story In Gloaming was made into 2 films. Dark is a past recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, and she's an associate professor at Rutgers-Newark in the MFA program, which I believe she heads. No, I'm not. Oh, you're not? No. People say well, I know she's the most important person in that program.
That was Rutgers calling.
Alex also lives in Montclair and is a member of the advisory board for Open Book, Open Mind. And of the book they will be discussing tonight, Fellowship Point, the New York Times Book Review said it's enthralling, masterfully written, a novel rich with social and psychological insights, earnest and sly, big ideas grounded in individual emotions, a portrait of a tightly knit community made up of artfully drawn individual souls. So please join me in welcoming Christina and Alice.
Everyone, it's on. Can you hear me? Great. No. Okay.
I don't think they're working.
Hello?
Okay.
I can talk loud.
I think we can hear you.
Hello? In the meantime, I just have to talk loud. Yeah,
Can everybody hear? No, it's gonna be hard to get back in here.
So Alex is gonna help us. He's our other librarian here. I'm Ariel Zeitler. I'm one of the librarians at Montclair Public Library, and we're really happy to have you here. We just want you to be able to hear us.
Check, 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 books, books, books.
Hi, everyone. There we are. It's such an honor to be here tonight with one of my dearest friends in the world, Alice. I lived in Montclair for more than 20 years, and when I moved here, I had very young children and I was teaching at NYU. And one of my favorite stories to teach was in the gloaming. And moving to New Jersey was a big step. And it was very exciting to know that I might be living in the same town as the author of this favorite story of mine. And when I met Alice, I was so starstruck. I could hardly believe it. And so since then, and if, by the way, if you haven't read In the Gloaming, please do. It's so phenomenal. And for those of you who haven't yet read at Fellowship Point, it gives you a little taste that's going to make you want to leap straight in. So Alice and I then became part of a Montclair writers group. I think a number of people are in the room. Will you raise your hand if you are in our group? Yes, and that group has been going strong for more than 2 decades. And then we're in a novel writing group as well for 20 years, and we're in a reading group together. And our reading group member is a member of the right here too. So we're just very delighted.
We have to be together at all times.
We have. So I'm honored to be here to introduce Alice and to stay out of the way mostly as I ask her questions and then open it up for you all to ask questions. But Alice, should we start maybe with a short bit of reading?
Sure, yeah, me too. Anyway, I want to say thank you so much to the library and to Christina for this evening. Very, very nice for me to be doing this in Montclair and at this library. I've been through it 100,000 times. You know, it's very meaningful. All right, I'm going to start just by reading a short description of the actual Fellowship Point, which is a point of land off the coast of Maine that's been owned by the same 5 families since 1875. In the current story, which is 2000 to 2002, there are only 3, they're not really owners, shareholders is what they think of themselves as. 3 shareholders left. And that's a big part of the plot, is one of them, Agnes, who's the protagonist, wants to break the fellowship agreement so she can have the land donated to a trust to protect it after her death. And a lot of the book is her trying to get the other people to agree, or some combination or some other solution. But I'm going to go back to very close to the beginning and just read a description of the point that's inside of a letter written to Agnes about a recent death of the old caretaker on the property, and Agnes wasn't able to go to his funeral. She's in Philadelphia at the time, and there really wasn't a funeral, but she wasn't able to go be with the family, which she wanted to. So this letter is written by the son of Hiram Circumstance, his name Robert Circumstance, and he's a big character in the book. Dear Agnes, it was so good to speak with you the other day. Hearing your voice, well, I felt better. I remember once when a pious visitor expressed shock over you and Polly laughing in the graveyard. If you can't laugh at death, what can you laugh at, you barked. I have reminded myself of that these days. It's difficult to know how best to mourn, what's efficient, effective, and honorable. I hit on an answer today. I thought you'd want to hear about it. I parked my car right off Shore Road at the top of the footpath. It snowed overnight, so the ground was dusted and a light wind blew, rattling the ice branches. I pictured Hiram, how his gait expressed his essential traits: dignity, caution, sense of purpose. I don't know where he is now, and I, like you, have never been tempted to subscribe to any notion of an afterlife. I'm content to remember him as he was. He was so often on Fellowship Point, even after we moved away. Where better to think of him? I came to the bottom of the hill and stood at the north end, surveying the whole point. I looked straight down the full length of the path to the Sank. From that distance, it appeared as an olive-rounded dome that made me wish I could paint. It's an Arthur Dove for sure. Then I took a deep breath, and the full feel of the place came to me. The pine scents, the bird calls, the booming of the rolling ocean. I headed straight down and checked on the eagle's nests. All looked well, no signs of trespassing or disturbance. I won't check again until after the eagles hatch, if any do this year. I walked by the site of the summer camp and around the shoreline and back up Point Path. By the graveyard, I thought of old friends and older inhabitants of what my father and yours called God's country.
So as you all can see and hear, the novel is rooted strongly in place. And you have such an incredible sense of it, the reader, of where we are. It's very grounded in Fellowship Point. And I know it's a question that you get often, but where is Fellowship Point?
I do get that question a lot. And when I was in Maine this summer, many people told me they know exactly where it is. And I said, this is where it is. They argued. So, no, it's an invented place, but, you know, we both go to Maine and the terrain is very familiar.
Would you say it's more, Alice and I coincidentally discovered that we go to the same island, Mount Desert Island, which is east of Bangor, I guess. It's kind of far up north. But would you say Fellowship Point is more central Maine, probably?
A little more, yeah, I would say probably a little west of Mount Desert, yeah.
So in interviews, you say that you worked on this book for a decade, but I know that it was more than that since your last book came out.
Yes.
And we've been talking about writing and doing writing ever since Think of England, which was your previous novel.
Yeah.
So what was that 20 years like for you? I actually haven't ever asked you this question. This is genuinely what I really want to know this. What was it like for you? Because you were working on other novels.
Yeah.
Okay, so how did this happen then?
After Think of England, well, that was kind of when I started teaching, and I realized that teaching and really working on becoming a good professor took a lot of mental energy. And also I still had a child at home who took a lot of every energy. But I tried 2 different novels that didn't work, and you were around for that. You know, I really tried to work them out. I just couldn't figure out the structure. They were both autobiographical to some degree, and that's difficult. You know, it's hard to get the right tone toward, especially the main character, it's someone someone you know, because you can't reduce them to the kind of math problem that a made-up character turns out to be.
Mm-hmm.
So then I started this at VCCA, which is an arts residency.
The Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. I know some of you have been there.
Yes. And it really started one day when I was there, and I just completely I hit a wall, and I just I can't do this anymore. I don't know what I'm doing. I can't figure this out. So I just sat in a chair for 5 hours looking out the window, total attitude of surrender. And I'm sure you know what that's like. And in some situation where you're just like, okay, I give up. I've hit bottom with this. And the character Virgil came at the end of that 5 hours. He was the first character in the book. And once he came, he was so fully imagined, and he had nothing to do with anything I had ever known or anyone I had ever known. I just had like a breakthrough into imagination, and away from trying to write something semi-autobiographical. I was in a different space. And then I knew I was going to have a book. I didn't know how or what, but I knew something was coming.
Do you remember how long ago that was?
Yeah, it was 2011.
So 11 years, so 10 years.
It did. I mean, I don't work during the semester, so I couldn't work on this book in the semesters because it's big and there are lots of moving parts and I can't do my job and work on this at the same time. So pretty much in the summers, I think I figured out if I put back to back, it probably took 4 years. But you know, it's attenuated by other things that I have to do.
Well, the book is nearly 600 pages, but you wrote 1,400 pages.
Yes.
And I remember that when you said, I'm finished, my book is 1,400 pages.
You want the rest of it.
I know, right? Yes, so actually, what happened to the rest of it and how did it happen that you, now, by the way, Alice and I have talked about the book before, but we decided tonight, because so many of you are writers in the room or somehow affiliated with words, that we would talk a little bit more about this kind of stuff than we have in the past. So we're just diving in here. So how did you go from 1,400 words to 600 words?
Well, I went to again.
That pages. Yeah.
I again did another residency. Residencies are great because you just have nothing. You're alone 23 hours a day. You have nothing to do. So a lot gets done. And I took the 1,400 pages to McDowell and I laid it all over the studio. And I just started to find threads between different pages and move them around and move them around. And then I started to push certain pages to the side. And I came up with a plot during that residency to figure out what this book was actually about.
So it's the 1,400 pages in a different order?
Yes, a lot of it was just writing into the characters and writing scenes to see how they acted with each other. They really were built by being in conversation with each other or doing things with each other. I never write one of those lists like, what's their favorite hobby or what's their
Yeah.
You know, I throw them in, see how they act and see what they do. I put them in very scary situations and see how they react. And then I figure out who they are. So then I needed a plot to contain the characters. And that I started to figure out that residency. Once I started to have that, it was easier to cut things.
So before the residency, did you have the land conservation plot?
No, I didn't. That came sort of during and after that.
Was it the relationships that you had before?
Yes, I had the people, I had the relationships. I wrote an early draft of the book that was just Polly and Robert, and their relationship, which I really loved. It's very beautiful. It wasn't a big enough book for a book, but it was very educational for me to see them. Robert's a smaller character in the book.
Well, let's quickly just say who these characters are. And also I wanted to ask you, let's pull back for a second. I want you to tell people, because you started with Virgil, who Virgil is as well, and then your central characters.
All right, Virgil's a man who is really in the backstory of the present 1960 to 1963 or 4. There's a whole section of the book in the middle that's written as an epistolary section. He is a young man who comes to the point because his relatives own one of the houses. And his old relative who isn't there says you can live in like the little, it was really a playhouse, which is totally unwinterized, but he moves in there with his little daughter. And he and Agnes become very involved with each other during that period.
And Agnes?
Agnes is probably the protagonist. At least she's the strongest character. I think there's 3 point of view characters, Agnes, Polly, and Robin. Agnes is an 80-year-old woman from Philadelphia, Quaker. She's an author. She has 2 strains of authorship. One is children's books, which have done very well, and as a series called When Nan, When Nan. spaceship or something. You know, she just writes these adventures, 9-year-old girl. And then her other authorship is pseudonymous, which she started when she was young. Every 10 years, she writes a novel about 5 Philadelphia girls. It's called the Franklin Square series. And it started when she was starting to see her friends in Philadelphia make themselves smaller, you know, from the girls they had once been. They marry, they go into jobs that they don't particularly like, all of that. And she was feeling very anxious about seeing what was happening. So that was the impetus for her first novel, but no one knows she's the author.
Which it has which eventually has a major part of the plot. So Agnes and Polly are 80 and they have this very lifelong friendship.
Lifelong friendship. They were born in the same year. They went to school together and they have houses next to each other on Fellowship Point.
And they're quite different from each other and they drive each other crazy.
They're different from each other. Polly is married with children and basically, I don't know if there's a new word beyond housewife, but she's in that space. And Agnes is single, never married, does her writing every day very seriously, but pretty much has her time to herself. So they do have very different obligations in the world, and they don't quite understand each other's loyalties or attitudes about their time, how they spend time.
One interesting thing about this novel is that it is very plotted. Surprising things happen throughout the novel, and there's suspense and there are twists and turns. But at the heart of it, it's a story about friendship. And you yourself have some very solid long-term relationships, friendships with women. What was it that interested you most in writing about female friendship?
To be honest, I didn't really think it was about female friendship.
Yeah.
That was just, I think, something I realized about myself writing this book is that was such a given for me because I went to a girls' school, K through 12. I still am friends with a lot of the kindergartners. You know, we've just stayed friends for life. And it's just such a given part of my life to have close female friendships. And that part of the book developed without any real thought on my part. And it's been reflected back to me so much about how this book is about a friendship. And I really honestly didn't even, that just was natural. I mean, I didn't purposely make it any way.
Yeah. In our reading group, we've read Middlemarch together. I know we've both read it a lot of times. We've read Anna Karenina and other big 19th century novels. And in reviews, Alice's book is often compared to large 19th century novels. I think someone called it contemporary 19th century novel because of the multiple perspectives, the scope, the breadth, and its classic structure. And you said that you set out to do that.
I did.
And so talk about that ambition, which is pretty large.
I know.
I know. No wonder it took 10 years. Okay, so talk about that ambition and how, sort of what steps you took to pull that off that might have been different from writing a regular contemporary novel.
It really was kind of shocking because I was a poet pretty exclusively until I was 30. And if you had told me that you're going to end up writing a big 19th century style novel, I wouldn't even understood what that meant. But I decided to do it after I watched a miniseries on TV called He Knew He Was Right by Anthony Trollope. I love that title so much. He Knew He Was Right. He Knew He Was Right. It's about a narcissist, obviously. It's really, when I was watching it, it's like, I love this. I love the twists. I love the reveals. I love, in those kind of books, there's subplots, but they are under the plot, but then they come up into certain points in the plot and they twist the main plot. Like that's the whole function of these subplots. And I was like, I can see it, but can I do it? you know, and I just decided I really wanted to try to learn it because it's so pleasurable. And I really didn't know if I was going to be able to do it. I wanted to have a big reveal in the book and a big, you know, I was a Chinese studies major at college. And one of the things that I learned in studying Chinese literature was that coincidence is a very high value in Chinese literature, Chinese film, that if you can call off a coincidence that is just very, you know, gratifying, but
Grounded.
yeah,
Yeah.
that it actually is not, you know, it doesn't feel like you're being thrown out of the story, but it's like, yes, of course they come back together at this point. I really like that they respect that because it is in 19th century novels. There are those kind of coincidences and characters crossing paths over and over. So I decided I really wanted to do that. There were just certain tropes that I thought I really would like to try to learn how to do this. And how did I do it? I don't know. I can't even remember. You know, I think it was more like thinking, okay, I wanted to some subplots. I just decided certain things, but I can't literally remember the day of it.
And I think a lot of that came together, as you said later, too.
It really came together.
You had all of these pieces and you were weaving a story with a conscious idea of doing exactly what you're talking about.
Yes.
And we've talked about how, you know, coincidence is not uncommon in life. And then,
Right.
you know, you say, oh my God, I cannot believe, and this could never be in a novel. We sort of laugh about that. And we've talked about how hard it is to pull off. For that reason, you're creating a world that's already asking people to suspend disbelief. And then to take it a step further and expect them to believe that a twist might, or a coincidence might make sense in the novel is so difficult.
I know it is difficult. I'm not sure it entirely works for every reader, but most people seem to appreciate it. So
We were talking earlier about the pages you cut, and there was one other piece of that, which is that when you worked with your editor, Mary Stupici, who's an incredible editor, she cut a whole swath.
she did. Well, I went to her office one day and she said, "You're going to be here all day." And brought in lunch, and her assistant was with her, really smart young man, and he had read the book and had notes. So we just went through the whole manuscript page by page. And at that point it was 800 pages. When I turned it in, it was 800 pages each. And we just made decisions of what can go to get it down to 600 pages.
Didn't you originally have male chapters?
Yes, I had 4 male point of view chapters. Those were cut. There was another section in the middle that was happening on a train that was cut. And then the first chapter, which they were 14. It was an early view of Agnes and Polly together on the point. It was a scene, it's still in the book. It's a scene where an eagle is killed, yes, by some local boys, and Agnes and Polly make a pact, you know, finger prick blood pact, that they're just going to protect that bird sanctuary forever. And I was sorry to cut that. The other ones made sense to cut because having the male chapters was a slightly different book, but I rewrote all of those chapters into the book. So they're there, they're just not there.
Do you think you'll use any of the material you cut in a different way?
Oh, yeah, keep asking.
It might be worth looking at.
People want to read those other stories. For sure, no, I don't know, maybe someday.
So you're writing about 80-year-olds. Not many books out these days
I
that
know.
are from the perspective of 80-year-olds. So what was it that interested you in writing about octogenarians?
I don't know, actually. It wasn't a plan. Again, the characters just came to me. Polly came to me, and then Agnes came to me. And I did not register that they were 80 until probably you know, I started 2011, so probably 2016, someone said to me, what's your book about? Someone who I don't know very well. And I heard myself saying, 2 80-year-old women, and I was like, oh my God, career suicide. This is just not gonna be fly. About 2 80-year-old women. And then I thought, well, I'm kind of in it now, so I'll just finish it for myself and then see what comes next. But I've always just really loved old women and find them very fascinating and mysterious because mostly you go in a room and they're there and no one really is talking to them. You know, but for some reason the invisibility thing kind of is real.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to, once I had more consciousness about it, I really began to think of things I wanted to say about older.
Well, I do remember at one point when you were talking about it in our writing group and you said, well, I have a 1,400-page novel about 2 80-year-old women who live alone in a remote corner of Maine. And are sort of misanthropic. So let's read another little section if you will. So I just want to tell you all, it's 20, let's see, we have 25 minutes left. Alice is going to read. I'm going to ask a couple more questions and then I'll open it up for you all.
Sorry. So I said a minute ago that I compress or change some of the male chapters, and there was a chapter from Dick's point of view. Dick is Polly's husband. He's a little bit of what my grandfather would call a horse's ass. He's a little bit of a horse's ass. But his wife is very loyal to him, and she keeps hoping that she's going to eke out the secret, wonderful inner self. He's been keeping safely hidden for his whole life. So now he's starting to.
Alice, a little closer.
I'm sorry. Was that better?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm very sorry. He's starting to deteriorate mentally a little bit, and he is very anxious. He's retired and things haven't gone as he hoped with his career. And he's waking up early in the morning and not really consciously awake, but he's talking to Polly. So she's coming in the room and listening to him talk about his life and his past. And I'm just going to read a little bit of it. His father wanted Dick to be a businessman, but Dick had no mind for numbers or for sales. He'd always been attracted to Quaker philosophy, and at college found he was good, the best in his class at Harvard, at formal logic. Polly asked if he'd made the right decision becoming a philosopher. This was the magic of these morning talks. She could ask questions that would make him impatient in the light of day. He said he'd studied and practiced philosophy because the world was a confusing place, and he wanted to further what understanding humans had come to and why, and how things might be better. The deeper in he waded, however, the more he suspected that he might be seeking an answer to a question he had about an indentation in his own being, as palpable to him as if a meteor had hit. He had a hole inside him like a deep black pool surrounded by rock. For a while he assumed everyone did. Wasn't that original sin, or the other way around? But during late night dorm confabs, he discovered other men felt whole. They had no suspicion, as he had, that they might implode into their own depths one day. He was always teetering and exhausted from keeping himself upright. Polly couldn't have been more shocked. She dared not respond at all, dared not remind him she was his audience. He wouldn't want her to know any of this. She sat absolutely locked into a stillness akin to invisibility until he dozed. When he woke up, she pulled the curtains open and he talked mildly about the weather. But she pondered what he said when she went upstairs after breakfast to take her nap. It seemed to her he spent his whole life hiding this central motivation. Whether that was good or bad, right or wrong, was beside the point now. What was left was to add pieces to the puzzle of him. Maybe this was what Agnes meant when she said Dick had a classic narcissistic wound. Poor Dick. The word wound was so sad. How did such a thing happen? Dick's parents had been like everyone else's as far as she knew.
Passage captures what you do so well in this novel, which is that we get to really feel the core of these characters, and even the ones who could be a sort of almost a joke from a distance or easy to dismiss. You allow us those moments of grace to get deep underneath the surface. How do you do that?
It's interesting. I don't really know exactly how I do it, but it just happens in writing. And I think I do what we all try to do when we write, is just go to a deep place inside myself. And then these things just come out. When people read parts of it to me, I'm like, I don't even remember writing it. You know, it just feels strange for me. But I've been a writing teacher for a really long time now. Some people don't. But at this point, I really teach personal development.
Meaning what, Alice?
So to get to a deep place inside yourself, how to know what you think about things, how to know how you feel, how to know how you feel about things, what your philosophies are, what your worldview is.
How do you do that as a teacher?
How do I do it?
Yeah, what do you mean that you teach that way?
Well, do a lot of discernment, thinking about things. Go back to the kind of things that we all talked about, maybe at college, maybe earlier. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in capital punishment? Do you believe in democracy? What is it? You know, go through all of these questions. Just try to remember what you actually think about things, because as we get older, we kind of take that for granted. It's not at the tip of our thoughts.
Right.
You know, it's just in
We
there.
spent a lot of years pushing it down.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so to try to surface a lot of those beliefs again, and also do, you know, certain exercises of writing and meditation and spiritual practices. I mean, I don't impose spiritual practices on anybody, but I ask them to think about, let's say, you know, moments when they felt a certain way, so that they can produce certain states when needed. You know, not to have to wait to feel inspired, not to have to wait to feel calm, just how to induce these states so that they can get to the deeper writing place.
Right, and especially if you're writing memoirs, one thing, because you're trying to get to that depth for yourself, but in the case of writing a novel like this with such a broad cast of characters, you're really trying to get at different motivations for each character. So you have to inhabit these different consciousnesses in a way that is a leap from even what you're talking about.
Yeah, it feels so much to me like I just listen to them and write down. I mean, it's not like channeling, I'm not being spooky about it, but I really just, they come as fully formed, so I just try to see what they need me to write down about them, if that makes any sense. I know it sounds a little abstract.
No, it does make sense. You have a character named Maud who's 26 years old, and you're in her head and feeling her feelings and living her life. How did you access Maud?
I really love Maud. She came a little bit later into the story, and when I started writing about her, she has kind of a difficult situation because she has a mother who's has intractable depression. I don't know if any of you know about depression that really is untreatable, but that's what she has. Very difficult to live with as a child when I was growing up, and she takes care of her mother now. And then she also has a child. She has a 3-year-old child, and she hasn't told anyone at work about her life, her private life. She really carries a lot on her shoulders. But when I was thinking about her, writing about her, I realized that I was reflecting quite a bit about how much I love my students, and especially probably the millennials, and their very, and their eagerness to get into the world, their unwillingness to do what my generation did, was slowly work, slowly be promoted, wait till someone notices. Just like so much more like, I'm gonna go take, I'm gonna go take what I need. And I admire that. I mean, it's very alien to me, even when I was writing Maud, because she is an assistant editor at a publishing house, and she's trying to get Agnes to write a memoir. And her idea for this is it'll get her ahead. So she wants Agnes to write, but she also wants to get ahead in publishing herself. And she's very assertive with Agnes. Even when I was writing those things, I was like cringing. Like, oh my God, you're only 26 and you're talking to this famous author. Oh my God, but it was fun. I really enjoyed it.
Surely you've had someone at your publishing house who's 26 talk to you in such a way.
Not quite as boldly as Maud, but yes. I mean, I certainly have students talk to me very, they get what they need.
Well, and your son was 26-ish, around that age while you were writing
That's
this
true.
too. I always think of that too, that access we have sometimes
That's
through the
true.
portal of our own children. Okay, I have one last question for you, and then I'll let you free to the group. So the Quakers of Philadelphia are at the heart of the novel. They're people of a religious tradition of equality, peacefulness, and modesty, and a cultural niche of extreme privilege and exclusivity. So can you talk about your interest in the Quakers?
I decided fairly early on that Agnes and Polly were going to be Quaker. And basically 2 reasons. One, I really grew up around Quaker practices and Quaker people. My school had been a Quaker school. It's not a Quaker school officially anymore, but we were exposed to a lot of Quaker practices and belief systems. My stepfather was a Quaker. I went to meetings with him a lot. So there was like the personal angle, but then there was also they're from Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is the Quaker city. And I thought, well, okay, I should just have them be Quakers. And I found that for a novel, it was an excellent choice, because the Quakers have very powerful values that are slightly aside from mainstream American culture. For example, pacifism, like Dick's book is about pacifism and the idea of egalitarian between men and women. They always had this idea, when the rest of the world was not even there. Lots of different things like that, and very clear values. And Agnes and Polly both practice those values. So that's good for creating dramatic situations, because, if they're trying to practice, let's say, peacefulness, and the situation comes on that's far from peaceful, are they going to be able to adhere to their values, or is their personality maybe going to override, and then that will create conflict?
Yeah,
So it's really good for the book.
so it's a good vehicle for conflict
Very good.
among many other things. Okay, great. So let's open up to questions. And I'll field them. Yes, in the back.
I loved your book so
Thank
much.
you.
I think it would be, Agnes is, in the very, very beginning, Agnes is reflecting on having a pseudonym, because she has to like eviscerate
The Franklin Square people, and she can't do it under her own name. And I'm also a mother of Montclair, and I'm recognizing all these people in the room. And I'm just wondering if you could talk at all about how you allow yourself to observe and write but also live in a community?
That's a really good question. Christina, you can speak to that too. I haven't really written about Montclair. I don't know if I would. Yeah, while I was living here, but that's exactly why she took on the pseudonym, because her editor says to her just offhand, she's 24 when she writes that first book, you're never going to be able to show your face in Philadelphia again. And she's like, she hasn't even thought of that. It's such a strange thing about writing. Writers in the room will know you really feel like you have a lot of privacy when you're doing it. You don't really consider what's going to happen when it goes out into the world until you have some experience. You see people make mistakes all the time with this. You know, they just don't understand what it's going to be like when other people read it. So I err on the side of not trying to hurt anybody's feelings. There's lots of choices to be made around that, and people make different choices. That's sort of been my choice in my practice. But
And then you're
I would love to have had a pseudonym. Just to have the freedom. It was fun to write someone who did, and it was right when Elena Ferrante was starting to publish her books. So I was watching because Agnes was doing the same thing. So I could see it on world stage, someone pulling that off. Right behind you.
You gave Agnes quite the practice for her writing. You know, she had a prescribed time of day that she sat down and she made sure nobody was bothering her. They knew what her routine was. But it doesn't, from what you've been saying now, it doesn't sound like you have a routine like that. You didn't give her your routine, or you do have a routine?
Her routine is my fantasy. There's a lot, like living next door to your best friend all your life. That's kind of a fantasy too, you know. I was able to put certain fantasies in the book, but no, that's nothing like my routine. I try to get up every morning and write at least a little bit, and if I have time, more than a little bit. Like every day is important, but I don't have the 5 hours most of the time.
There's a man right behind.
That was very cool that your character came way before plot as you developed it. But I found the plot fascinating, incredibly tightly woven, beginning to end. Can you describe the creative process to go from a pile of characters to a really well woven plot?
I'm trying to remember. No, I think it really was just looking at it, taking notes, stepping back. Like, if I do this, will this happen? No, she needs to do this and she needs to do that. But that was fairly late in the book. It was fairly late when things started. I always think of it as like, suddenly it's all over the place, and then suddenly it becomes a jigsaw puzzle, and then suddenly it's able to be put together. But I can't really explain exactly how that happened. I knew it had to happen, so I just kept pushing for it to happen. But I didn't have the ending that's there now until after the book was already typeset. I wrote probably the last 30 or 40 pages. I just didn't like the ending that I had. So I thought, okay, I'm going back and rewriting. So that a lot of that ending plot came, it was already in pages. And they were nice enough to let me do that. They were nice enough to let me.
That was crazy. Can I have your thing?
Yes.
Yes, sorry. I just have a related question that I meant to ask you before, which is 19th century novels like Middlemarch have a lot often about land and
Yeah.
ownership and family trusts and things like that. And I was so struck by that reading in your novel, all of that. And then the land conservation piece. And I wondered when that came in to the process.
I really got that idea from visiting my friend Tina in California. She had a job working for University of California with Janet Napolitano, who was president at the time of the university, cataloging the thousands and thousands of acres of land that University of California owns. So much of it had been given, never even really written down, except for like the, some land give a deed or something. So she was telling me about a lot of this old ranches that have been donated and how many of them were given by women. And then I started doing research about women donating land, starting national parks, starting land trusts, and very fascinating story, which I don't have time to go into now, but there's an untold story of women just giving their land away. So then I started looking into laws about ownership. And it really wasn't until 1900 across the United States that women were allowed to have a say about the land they owned. They were allowed to own land, but brother, husband, father, uncle, some male person would decide what was going on with the land. So it gave me the idea of 19th century novel, except women on the land, and do they do something different, or are they going to do something the same? That was really like the central motor of the plot. And it did come from a few different, from deciding I wanted to do the 19th century, and then from understanding that something I really hadn't known about, how much land in this country has been donated by women. Thank you. You're welcome.
More?
So I want to say I gave the book to my mom, who's 88, and she's a lifelong writer and reader. And just the idea that you wrote for a woman like that, someone in their 80s could see themselves reflected. So thank you for that. So when I was reading the book, I felt like it was a feminist novel. Did you set out to do that?
I think it's like the friendship. It's just like such a deep bedrock part of me. That has been said to me by editors that this is just such a feminist book. And, Agnes says that, I think there's a point where someone says, are you a feminist or something? Or she says, I'm an egalitarian. It includes trees, it includes animals, it includes everything. So I think that was more of the philosophy in the book, but I definitely was aware of showing certain kinds of constraints on women without hammering the point too hard, just like lived life and the way it goes, which we're all aware of. Okay. Yes. There's one.
So thank you certainly for the book and for inventing or creating, she came to you, Agnes. And I felt like this feisty, very self-confident and caustic and humorous woman who I think was a nun who took a vow of writing.
It's funny you say that because my thought, when I was working with her, I just thought, Mother Superior, she's a Mother Superior.
Without the bad part, the habit. So, and I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but it seemed to me reading that Agnes has to be Alice, except the nun and no sex part. And you mean me? She got me? I thought she's you. Well, yeah. The way you spoke of writing here earlier and how you instruct your students, there's a line in the book. May I quote you?
I don't remember it, but
I'll try to remind you. This is Agnes, of course. You don't have the 5 hours and you're not sitting in picture windows looking out at the ocean in Maine, or sometimes you are, but she's alone, literally. Yet she was choosing words with the intention that they serve as stepping stones between herself and the mind and heart of another person. It was a miracle that this was possible. That to me describes you, and you self-described that way earlier.
I want to know that.
Any other questions? We've got her here.
Thank you, Alice.
Part of this process, which is that we're going to do a book signing and sale in the other room with Watch on Booksellers. Are kind enough to be here. And both Christina and Alice are going to be selling and signing their books. And I always feel personally that if you really admire a writer, the most sincere compliment you can pay them is to own a copy of their book. I'm planning to buy one for my sister. So thank you all so much for coming. And on this kind of sort of semi-historic moment for us as a library, having open mind coming back in person, we're so glad that you're here.
Yeah, thank you.